Alright, so let's move on now and talk about the next evolution of Travis Hershey's research, which really started in the 1980s but culminated in a book that he published with Michael Gottfredson in 1990 called A General Theory of Crime. Most people refer to this book and the theory that came out of it as self-control theory. But if you hear the phrase self-control theory and the phrase general theory of crime, you should know that those two things are the same. We're talking about the same ideas here. The theory that got put out by Gottfredson and Hershey in 1990. Now, think back to what Travis Hershey was writing about in the 1960s, early 1970s. He was interested in understanding a person's social bonds, bonds to things like family, school, activities, morals, values. Well, he takes a pretty interesting departure from that in the general theory of crime, because he's no longer looking at social control anymore with its multiple elements. He kind of abandoned the idea of elements of the social bond. So nowhere in this book will you see reference to the idea of a person's attachment, involvement, commitment, or belief. Instead, what he develops and talks about in this book, along with Michael Gottfredson, is a concept that he described as a person's self-control. And this really became the main concept of the book and the main explanation for criminal behavior. He believed that people who have different levels of self-control are going to be at higher and lower risks for committing crime. And the reason that they called this the general theory of crime is they really felt like this could explain almost all types of criminal behavior. And not just criminal behavior, but other analogous, impulsive, risky acts. So this is a general theory of crime, and they really mean that. They really mean that this theory, they believe they've developed a theory here that can serve as the primary example and explanation for most types of behavior that end up being criminal. And at the heart of this theory is the concept of a person's level of self-control. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of a person's self-control, because this is a very different idea than what Travis Hershey developed earlier in his career. According to Gottfredson and Hershey, a person's level of self-control is something that's internal. It's a time-stable trait. After you develop and establish the level of, your level of self-control, that level of self-control is going to remain fairly stable throughout your life. It's not something you can really improve upon once it's been set. And for them, the point at which they mark someone as probably establishing their stable level of self-control is at about age 5. So they put it at age 5, I think, for a couple reasons. Prior to age 5, the people that you're in most contact with are in the home. They really felt like this was a trait that you develop in early development, in early childhood, by your parents. So they put the cutoff at age 5 because at age 5, that's when you start going to kindergarten, you start socializing more with others. They wanted to make this theory a theory of early development. So, according to them, the level of self-control that you all have is something that was instilled in you, that you developed right around by age 5. And even though you've matured and developed and grown over time, you've kept kind of the same level of self-control, according to Gottfredson and Hershey. And, understandably, their explanation for criminal behavior is people who have established really low levels of self-control, people who don't have a lot of ability to control themselves, are people who cannot delay immediate gratification. People who have impulses and can't check them. If you have low self-control for them, that is going to make you very likely to not only commit crime, but to commit a lot of other risk-taking, impulsive acts. Now, again, they believe that this is established by age 5, and one of the big reasons for that is they feel like parents are the people who are most important in instilling and establishing a child's level of self-control. So you learn and you build your level of self-control from your parents. So this is a general theory of crime because they really believe that after you leave the nest, after you start socializing more, however your parents helped, whatever level your parents instilled in you in terms of controlling yourself, controlling your emotions, your impulses, your aggressions early in life, that's going to stay with you for the rest of your life. It's actually a pretty simple model when you actually think about it, because for them, ineffective parenting is what leads to low levels of self-control. So ineffective parenting is bad because it causes children to establish a low level of self-control, and over time, what happens as a result of having a low level of self-control is a stable pattern of crime and other analogous behaviors. And when I say analogous behaviors, what I mean is other risky, thrill-seeking, impulsive behaviors. So in their book, Gottfredson and Hershey use examples like promiscuity, heavy drug use, a lot of smoking and drinking, destructive behaviors, all of those kind of things that you would imagine a person who can check and control their impulses would be able to resist over time. Gottfredson and Hershey saw as examples of evidence of a person having low self-control. And again, really the key to how self-control gets established for Gottfredson and Hershey is how well your parents were able to parent you very early on in life. So kind of similar to, if you think back to all the way back to the beginning of our social control lecture today, the role of the parent is really primary in this theory of crime. So the theory, this general theory of crime, the reason that they're calling it general is they really believe that there are some characteristics of almost all types of crimes and almost all criminals, which explain why it is that they come to develop and coexist together. So obviously we can all think of examples of crimes which might not perfectly fit into their assertions here, but Gottfredson and Hershey would argue that their theory does a better job at explaining a large portion of criminal behavior than any other theory of crime. So they start out with these 4 assertions. First of all, they talk about crime, what crime is. For them, crime is exciting. Crime is risky. It requires, for the most part, very little planning, and for the most part, the benefits that you want to get out of a criminal act are things that you experience almost immediately. If your crime is a violent crime, you're hitting someone because you think that's going to make you feel better afterwards. You're hitting someone because you're angry. You want to blow off steam. There are examples of things you can imagine that make sense for this depiction of crime. For the most part, crime is something that you do for a large part because of the rush, the risk, the excitement of it. And subsequently, their characteristics of criminals seem to match the features of crime. So for Gottfredson and Hershey, criminals tend to be impulsive people. They tend to be adventurous, very active, physical people. They tend to have a really poor job history. People that can't really stay and commit to one thing for a long period of time, whether it's a job or a spouse or a group of friends. All of these characteristics of criminals, according to them, make it make sense that they're going to commit crime. People who are impulsive and adventurous are going to seek out adventurous behaviors. Most of the time, crime fits into that type of behavior. And for Gottfredson and Hershey, low self-control is the primary driving force behind this. Because of your low self-control, that causes you to be an impulsive, adventurous, active person, thus seeking out things like crimes that are exciting, risky, etc. Low self-control for Gottfredson and Hershey is something that can be established and identified early in life. So they really felt like your level of self-control is a stable construct. You can't do that much later in life to change your impulse control, your ability to control yourself over time. And again, what's the primary cause behind low self-control? For Gottfredson and Hershey, it's ineffective child rearing. That's the most important contributor, according to them, to a person establishing a low level of social control. So these are their 4 assertions. Very different from the ideas in social bonds. Really, according to them, they think of self-control as a trait, as something you have, it's set early in life, and there's not that much you can do about it. So, if you're someone who has low self-control, you're likely to be a criminal or commit crime-like acts your entire life because of this level of low self-control. Think back to the age crime curve. Now, if you remember, the age crime curve describes a spike in offending that begins in adolescence, peaking right around ages 18 to 20, followed by kind of a steady decline. Well, this is something that we all know about at this point. It has a lot of support. There aren't a lot of people debating that the age crime curve exists. So, kind of right away, after Gottfredson and Hershey wrote their theory, there were critics of the theory saying, this spike shouldn't really happen if the theory is correct as they place it. Why would there be such a spike in late adolescence if low self-control is set by age 5? In other words, if you already have low self-control, shouldn't you already be higher in criminal and delinquent activity before you enter your teenage years? So one of the big criticisms is, if low self-control is stable by age 5, why is there a huge spike in offending in the late teens? Now, Gottfredson and Hershey had an answer to this. They had an opinion about why it is that the age crime curve exists, even in the face of their theory. And their explanation to it has not always been very satisfying to criminologists, because their explanation of the age crime curve is that the relationship between age and crime is invariant. It doesn't change. They acknowledge, they accept the crime curve that you see before them. And they acknowledge the fact that the age crime curve happens in all countries throughout time. It has happened over many decades. Therefore, for them, and this is kind of hard for some people to accept, because it's so consistent, we shouldn't worry about explaining it. It's not going to change. Everyone experiences it. So trying to explain the relationship between age and crime isn't something that they thought was that important. What was more important to them was to explain how people develop different levels of control, because that is what's going to set kind of stable differences in people's criminal behavior throughout their lives. So think about it this way. This probably sounds a little confusing, but think about it this way. They really saw the age crime curve as masking differences between two very different types of people. People with low self-control and people with high self-control. So people that have low levels of self-control are probably always going to be much different than people that have high self-control. In other words, their level of self-control, people that have low self-control, is always going to be relatively higher than people with high self-control. In other words, they're not really arguing that almost everyone goes through a period of time in late adolescence where they get into a little bit of trouble. They're more likely to commit some crimes. Almost everyone goes through this. It's just that people with low self-control go through it and experience a much more significant jump in criminal behavior. So if you look at the graph that I'm showing you here, they see the age crime curve as predominantly being made up of people that have low self-control. People that high self-control still go through a slight rise in criminal behavior, but relatively, people that have low self-control are always going to have higher crime. So even if you look at the tail, the desisting period of time in the 20s into your 50s, people that have low self-control do decline. They're not denying that almost everyone stops committing crime over time, but those low self-control people are always going to be slightly higher. They're always going to commit slightly riskier behavior than similar other people in their age group. They're always going to have a relative distance between them and people that have developed a high level of self-control. And you'll see in the next class, when we talk about a little bit more about the relationship between age and crime, not a lot of people are very satisfied with this explanation. Because basically, when you ask Gottfredson and Hershey, well, why do people desist from committing, why do people desist? Why do people with low self-control stop committing crime? Their response to that tends to be, well, they do. I mean, why try to explain it? Everyone does, including the people with low self-control. Let's not explain that. let's be more concerned in what created the distance between these two groups to begin with.